Disclaimer. This channel is ran solely by a disabled person who has a speech impairment. A speech impairment is not a sign of an intellectual disability. It is a sign of physical disability. I have manually added subtitles for those who are not accustomed to my speech. If you stick around, I guarantee you will become accustomed to my speech. This channel is always a work in progress. Mistakes will happen. I will try my best to limit them, though. Finally, this channel will feature a lot of true crime content. Viewer discretion is advised.
What happens when the very people trusted to protect society's most vulnerable become the ones who harm them? Behind closed doors, it's often headlines like the chilling crisis, the immersion of people with disabilities by their caregivers. Hi, welcome back to my channel. I'm glad you're here. Today I'm going to tackle a sensitive issue. My mom says I always cover dark topics, and it's true. I don't know, I guess I'm just a serious person. That's who I am. But I'm going to cover a topic that doesn't get covered a lot, and that is caregiver violence, the abuse and murder of disabled people by their caregivers. I'm trying to pivot my channel to more of a true crime channel covering people with disabilities. Because that's one thing I've learned. So whatever topic you're talking about, you can always find a way to relate it to people with disabilities. Because disabled people are all over society. We're everywhere in society. Sometimes people don't think we are, but we are. We are everywhere in society. I like true crime. And I thought this would be a way to meet my two favorite topics. So sorry, Mom, I guess my YouTube channel is going too dark. Time to get small again. There. Now here we go. The weight of silence, confronting caregiver violence against disabled people. Introduction. What occurs when those we rely upon, the very individuals entrusted with our care and well-being, become the source of our suffering? Behind closed doors and sanitizer reports, and often hidden from public view, lies a heartbreaking and often overlooked crisis, the abuse and murder of disabled people by those who are supposed to protect them. Caregivers, family members, and sometimes even professionals. This is not just a statistical problem, it's a deeply human tragedy. It challenges assumptions about care, societal values, and trust. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that systems meant to protect society's most vulnerable often fail. That cultural narrative can often obscure and dismiss pain, and that silence and complicity can perpetuate harm. What happens when the very people meant to provide support, comfort, and protection turn into sources of harm? This question has haunted me for years. Personally, as a disabled person, and academically, as a person with disability studies. It's a question that exposes the contradictions at the heart of society, the trust we place in caregivers, and the brutal reality that sometimes that trust is betrayed. Throughout my life, I've been grappling with the uncomfortable truth that sometimes violence against people with disabilities isn't always dramatic or overt. It often doesn't make headlines or become subjects of lengthy investigations. Instead, it manifests quietly, incrementally, insidiously, and with devastating consequences. The subtle erosion of autonomy, the neglect, massive care, and in worst case, physical and emotional abuse that ends in tragedy. I've realized that society still struggles to confront caregiver violence head on. When these tragedies do surface, whether through the media or advocacy campaigns, they're often fleeting, dismissed, or framed in ways that diminished the severity of what happened. Too often the public response is muted, or worse, sympathetic to the perpetrator. This isn't accidental. It's embedded in cultural narratives, systemic failures, and deep-rooted ableism that devalues disabled lives. Every March, disabled communities around the world observe the Disability Day of Mourning. On this day, advocates and disabled people around the world gather together to read the names of those who have been by their caregivers or family members. These aren't just statistics, they are individuals, each with a story, a voice, and a future that was cut short. These names are a stark reminder that the violence is real, that is ongoing, and that society must confront it. This video is an aid to analyze the roots of this violence, understand its systemic causes, and explore pathways for meaningful change. It's a call for society to learn, to recognize our collective responsibility, and to take concrete steps to protect the most vulnerable among us. When care becomes control, the relationship between caregiver and disabled person is complex, nuanced, and often fraught with power imbalances. For many of us who depend on others for our daily basic needs, whether it's assistance with basic dressing or mobility, the relationship hinges on a fragile trust. It's built on necessity, dependence, and often a desire for dignity and independence. But dependency creates a delicate balance, one that can easily tip into control and tragically abuse. Caregiver violence manifests in many forms: verbal neglect, physical abuse, financial abuse, sex, and in the most horrific cases, murder. What makes this violence especially devastating is the context. Unlike other crimes that occur in public or in an overtly hostile environment, caregiver often occurs behind closed doors, away from witnesses, and under the guise of routine care. For people who may be nonverbal, cognitively disabled, or socially isolated, this vulnerability is even more pronounced. Often exploit these vulnerabilities in the victim's inability to communicate or seek help makes them easy targets. When a occurs, the consequences are profound. Physical injuries, emotional trauma, loss of trust, and sometimes the ultimate tragic death. What makes these cases particularly heartbreaking is that the victim may be entirely dependent on their caregiver for survival. They are trapped in a cycle where escape may be impossible or exceedingly difficult. Consider the case of someone who can't speak for themselves. If the caregiver chooses to silence or harm them, there may be no one to hear their cries or notice signs of abuse. When authorities or healthcare professionals do investigate, responses are often insufficient, disbelieving, dismissive, or slow to act. The system is often ill-equipped to detect or prevent these abuses, especially where the signs are subtle or when the victim can't advocate for themselves. Society's narrative ignores stories. The way media portrays disabled people has a profound impact on public perception. Too often these stories are framed in such a way that diminishes the severity of the crime or shifts the blame to the victim or family. Headlines like "Mother Breaks After Years of Caring for Son" or "Father Charged After Tragic Incident with an Autistic Daughter" focuses on the caregiver's suffering, implying that the act was a moment of breakdown, an unfortunate consequence of stress, rather than the criminal act that it is. While caregiving is undeniably demanding, framing it as a breakdown minimizes the gravity of harm caused. This kind of framing encourages the public to see these acts not as the criminal acts they are, but as expressions of caregiver burnout. It shifts the responsibility from systemic failures and onto the individuals or family. It also deprives the victim of agency, reducing them to passive recipients of tragedy, rather than active individuals whose lives mattered. In disability studies, there's a phenomenon called compulsory able-bodiedness. The societal expectation that the normal life free of disability is the ideal. When a disabled person is harmed or killed, it's often seen as a tragedy, not the preventable injustice it is. Society tends to romanticize or pity rather than recognize the inherent dignity of disabled people. Within disabled communities, however, deaths are viewed differently. We see them as preventable tragedies. They read out loud during the Disability Day of Mourning are not seen as cautionary tales. They are seen as kin. We recognize the pattern. Signs of neglect that we ignored. Cries for help that we unheard. Excuses made in court. We ask ourselves, if society truly valued our lives, would our kids be so quickly forgiven or forgotten? Discovering the Disability Day of Mourning. The idea of a day dedicated to the remembrance of victims of caregiver violence emerged from decades of activism and collective mourning. It was during a period of reflection that I discovered the Disability Day of Mourning. I was trying to think of a YouTube channel I could do related to people with disabilities. I didn't want to do the typical vlog about a day in the life of someone with a disability. There are many of those out there, and for a number of reasons, it just wouldn't work logistically. So I started thinking about my love of true crime. And then I wondered if I could marry my two interests, true crime and disabled people. So I started researching if there were crimes involving people with disabilities. And that's how I stumbled on the Disability Day of Mourning. Despite being deeply involved with the disabled community for over 25 years, the names of those we lost remain hidden to me. Hidden in the shadows of mainstream consciousness. And then I thought, if I, someone who is deeply involved with the disabled community and a true crime addict, had never heard of this, maybe then a lot of people haven't heard of this problem. When I visited the website dedicated to the Disability Day of Mourning, I was overwhelmed by the list of names. Hundreds of individuals whose lives were cut short. Many of these cases I've never encountered before. What disturbed me most was how often these cases were dismissed or minimized. It made me realize just how deeply these tragedies remain invisible outside disabled communities. This realization became a turning point. If I, someone embedded in the disability community for 25 years, had never heard of these victims, how many others outside the circle remain unaware? How many lives lost, quietly unnoticed and unacknowledged every year? The Disability Day of Mourning is not just a memorial, it is a call to action, a demand for justice, and a reminder that these victims are more than statistics. They are individuals whose lives matter. Systemic failures. Why does this happen? Understanding the systemic roots of caregiver violence requires examining the larger societal failures that enable or fail to prevent abuse. In graduate school, I learned about the social model of disability, the idea that societal inaccessible environments discourage discriminatory attitudes and lack of support creates barriers that disable people more than our bodies or minds do. But when it comes to caregiver violence, the framework is less developed. Who prevents disabled people from harm within our own homes? And what happens when those protections are weak or absent? Support systems for disabled people are fragmented and often bureaucratic. Social workers are overwhelmed with caseloads so large that meaningful oversight is impossible. Access to in-home care, respite services, and accessible housing is limited, especially for those in rural areas or those with low income or undocumented. Many areas lack the infrastructure to enable disabled adults to live independently, especially if their caregivers are unfit or abusive. The courts often dismiss or diminish disabled victims' testimonies. Judges and juries may see disabled people as unreliable witnesses, or worse, incapable of being harmed in the same way non-disabled individuals are. And you might say, Chelsea, that's crazy. But it's true, in some courts, judges don't think people with disabilities are reliable. This bias allows abuse to persist, hidden, unpunished, and often ignored. While many caregivers do compassionate, life-affirming work, the system should not rely solely on their goodwill. It must have safeguards, oversight mechanisms, reporting channels, and protection services that prioritize the safety and dignity of disabled individuals. Paths towards change. Change is possible and necessary, but it requires a comprehensive approach that involves cultural shifts, systemic reform, and empowering disabled voices. I came up with 5 things society could do to improve disabled lives. 1. Reframe the narrative. Our societal stories about disability must change. Media outlets, educators, and policymakers must focus on agency, resilience, and the diversity of disabled. Stories should highlight disabled individuals' voices, ambitions, and joy, rather than painting them as one-dimensional. Either they are seen as tragic or inspiring. Disabled people are complicated. They might be inspiring in one area of their life, but tragic or just normal in other areas of life. Journalists covering caregiver violence should avoid sensationalism that romanticizes or minimizes the crime. Instead, they should focus on the victims' experiences, humanizing their story, and challenge stereotypes. 2. Strengthen support systems. Support for caregivers must be expanded and made accessible. This includes increased funding for in-home care, respite services, and recognizing caregiving as labor that requires compensation training in. Similarly, disabled people should be empowered to live independently where possible, with access to trained personal assistants who respect our autonomy. Building a robust system for independent living is essential for our dignity and safety. Build accountability and oversight. Waiting systems that actively monitor and address abuse. Regular check-ins from social services, anonymous reporting channels, and independent ombudsmen are vital. These mechanisms must prioritize autonomy and safety of disabled people, not just convenience or caregiver reputation. 4. Center disabled voices in policy making. Too often, disability policies are crafted without the input of disabled people ourselves. That needs to change. Disabled individuals, especially those facing intersecting marginalization, must be at the forefront of designing laws, services, and oversight structures. Lived experience isn't just valuable, it's essential. 5. Elevate the Disability Day of Mourning. This vital event must be recognized nationally. It needs to be included in public calendars, incorporated in educational and curriculum, and covered by the mainstream media. It's a day of collective remembrance and a tool for advocacy, reminding society that these lives matter and their laws demand action. Moving towards justice. Caregiver violence isn't just a series of isolated incidents. It's a reflection of societal failure. A mirror revealing how little we value disabled lives and how easily we accept control and violence as part of the caregiving landscape. The violence often flourishes in silence, behind closed doors, hidden from view. Is normalization by cultural narratives that depict disability as a tragedy or a burden. It's enabled by systemic neglect, underfunding, and biases that dismisses disabled people's right to dignity and safety. I believe wholeheartedly that change is possible. It begins with honesty, acknowledging the depth of the problem, listening to disabled voices, and committing to systemic reform. As someone living with a disability and working within these systems, I know the path forward isn't simple. It requires courage. Courage to confront the uncomfortable truth, challenge ingrained attitudes, and demand accountability. Every name read out loud during the Disability Day of Mourning is a stark reminder this is real, it's painful, and it's urgent. When we refuse to look away, when we name and confront these injustices. We take vital steps towards a world where care is rooted in respect, compassion, and human dignity, where every disabled life is valued equally. Conclusions. Caregiver violence exposes a society that too often devalues disabled lives, romanticizing control and neglect while shrouding the truth in silence. It thrives in the shadows, perpetuated by systemic failures and cultural indifference. But it's not an inevitable part of caregiving. It is a societal failure, what we can and must confront. It begins with listening. Listening to disabled voices, recognizing our inherent worth, and challenging narratives that diminish us. Living with a disability and studying the systems meant to support us has shown me that change is possible. It is a matter of collective will, of investing in infrastructure and protection, and naming the violence for what it is, an injustice that must end. Each name read out loud during the Disability Day of Mourning is a call to action. It reminds us that these tragedies are real. They demand our attention, and that moving forward requires commitment, courage, and compassion. When society finally acknowledges the full humanity of disabled people and prioritizes our safety and dignity, we take a vital step for justice, because every life lost is a tragedy and every life saved is a victory. Well, that's it for caregiver violence. I hope you found this video essay interesting and educational. I know it's a dark subject, but dark subjects need to be addressed. They need to be talked about so we can move forward. Thank you for watching. If you like this content, you know what to do. Goodbye.